Hello and welcome to section 2 of the motor system, speech motor system. So now we're going to speak about motor activation. In the previous section, we covered sensory processing and making the script for speech, and then the programming and how the areas of planning and programming work together to finally produce a script for speech and the movements that will be performed before you actually start any motor activation. So now we'll speak about the process of motor activation itself. So keep in mind that you have the cortex, the top layer of the brain. That is about less than a quarter of an inch. And that is where the gray matter is. It is called gray matter because the cell bodies basically live in that area. And then you have below, you are going to have the basal ganglia, and then below you are going to have the brain stem. In between, you have the white matter, and the white matter is basically the axons that can go from the cell bodies and go down to connect to the lower parts of the brain. So these axons that have to do with motor abilities, they form what is known as the pyramidal tract, or the pyramidal track, or the pyramidal pathway. And that pyramidal pathway goes from your primary motor cortex, and that is part of the entire cortex that cover, and then it goes down as a pathway, and then it connects finally to the brain stem, and then the brain stem, it synapses with the cranial nerves that connect with your facial muscles, with your laryngeal muscles, and muscles of respiration, and everything that you use to activate muscles for speech. So just keep in mind again, this part, motor activation, goes from the cerebral cortex and finally to the brain stem, to where the roots of the cranial nerves are. So that area, and the connection between these two is the pyramidal tract that sends down the signals. That is the connection point. So first, this stage involves initiation of the movement itself. Now you have the movement planned out, played, like you act out a play before you actually perform it, and then it is sent finally to the premotor areas, and finally to the primary motor cortex itself. The anatomy, from an anatomic perspective, you call the primary motor cortex, you call it the precentral gyrus. And from a functional perspective, because you speak about what it does, you say that area is called the primary motor area, or the motor strip, sometimes they call it, you call it, in terms of the function, you focus on the function that it does, but every part of the brain has these two parts. Sometimes it has an anatomic name and description, and a physiologic, or a label for the function that it does. So first, once the signal goes to the area of the motor cortex, the motor that is represented, as you could see, by the motor homunculus that we discussed before, and the lower segment of the motor cortex, that area that is dedicated to the face and to the neck and other areas that have to do with speech, then it is activated, and then the signal goes through the pyramidal pathway, and finally the movement is initiated. So while the movement is initiated, this is just a summary, then you need to have sensory feedback coming back from the organs that move. And you need to find, to channel that sensory feedback to the area that gives the intention in the first place, that gives the command to move, and also to the planning areas as well. So that feedback is channeled constantly while you are performing your movements for speech, and in terms and also the content and so on. And that guides the modification. It enables the prefrontal cortex to make modifications, and it enables the motor cortex itself to implement changes, so you can correct what you are saying and match it with the intent that you originally had. So again, I want to emphasize that the motor activation segment or phase goes hand in hand with the coordination phase. The coordination phase happens at the same time, so it can guide, it can serve as a mirror that you look at while you are performing the movements, so this way you can correct immediately and prevent future repetition of the errors that you make. So this is accomplished by the primary motor cortex, the brain stem, and the spinal cord. And in between, again, we have to keep in mind that the connection between the primary motor cortex and the brain stem is that pathway, the pyramidal pathway, or the pyramidal tract. Processing occurs mostly in a serial fashion with some parallel processing. So serial means one step leads to the next, one step activates the next, but there are also some processes that happen at the same time, kind of parallel, like sensory processing, for example. Feedback has to come exactly parallel while the motor activation is taking place. So you could see now, here is the that pink gyrus and the blue gyrus. The line in between, or the sulcus in between, is the central sulcus, or the central fissure, or the Rolandic fissure. The gyrus in front is the primary motor cortex, if you speak about the physiology of the function. Or you could describe it anatomically as the precentral gyrus, the gyrus that's in front of the central sulcus, or the area behind that is part of the parietal cortex, that is called the somatosensory cortex, or the primary somatosensory cortex. And it is it really gives you the sensation for the same body parts that you can move voluntarily. So here you move the organ, and here you get the sensation from it. So you can now look at the two areas magnified. If you have a coronal cut, you could see now the sensory homunculus, that image of that little man sitting there, and you can see now this area here between the hemispheres. That area extends, and it gives you sensations from your toes, and then up in this area, your foot, this part of the foot, and then the ankle, and then the knee, and then the torso, and you name it. And then as you keep going, this area is for the hand and digits, or fingers, and then so much of it is dedicated to the face and throat and so on. So that lower part of it. Again, across from it directly, you are going to have, as you see, the motor homunculus that shows you what part here connects with what part of the body so that it can move it. You can think as if it is almost like a switch here. Once it is pushed, then that toe is going to move. And this area is going to, for example, the switch for that is going to be your little toe, and so on. So every area has a button or has an activation, neurons that can activate a particular part of your body. This is about voluntary movement. So things that you want to move. We're not speaking about the stomach or about internal organs, for example. So again, we spoke about this before, but you could see there are two areas that are parallel from this red or pink area. you get the motor movements, and then immediately from the sensory part, that's going to give you the sensation of that movement, or the sensation of pain and any kind of sensory input that has to do with sensation. So now we look, here is the motor homunculus again, or a view of the motor cortex, and you could see now how the fibers make bundles and they go down to make the motor pathways. So now we have the upper motor neurons coming down to make the cortical bulbar tract that goes from the cortex and to the brainstem. And some of the fibers, as you see, could go down, but then you have the upper motor neurons that are not very highlighted here, but they go also down, but they go down to the brainstem, through the brainstem, and go down to the spinal cord. They are, go kind of mostly when they start to synapse from the spinal cord and the brainstem way down to the rest of your body. So the cortical areas, again, are connected. You can see that little piece of tissue on top, that gray matter, is connected to the brainstem through the lower motor neurons in the brain. Through the what do you call it? The pyramidal tract, and that part is the upper motor neurons. They are called upper because they basically, go from the cortex to the brainstem, and they connect with the synapse with the spinal cranial nerves, and that connects with your muscles of speech. So, and again, this is another image that will show you how the pathway, goes. We're not going to spend too much time on the spinal, components, because we obviously are more interested in the speech parts, just that. So you could see now, this is an image of the connections that you would have. This is the gap, or the fissure between the two hemispheres, called the longitudinal fissure, that goes from the front all the way to the back. And you can see how these association fibers link one segment of the brain to the other, and then you kind of look here. Finally, are going to see the pyramidal tract coming down, and the decussation that we discussed before, where in the bottom of the medulla, fibers from the right side cross over to control the contralateral side of the body, and the opposite side happens. So that area is called the pyramidal decussation, or decussation of the pyramids. These pyramids are, when you look at the medulla, it's like two inverse pyramids that are formed by parts, so in part by the lower motor neurons. So now let's kind of unpack things and discuss how each area contributes to the process of speech. So the cortical movement centers, which include the primary motor cortex, that's like the engine that has the physical thing that actually connects and makes things, gives the signal finally to make things move. It has motor control, a motor control map of the entire body. So every part that you can move, every part of your body is connected, as we could show using looking at the homunculus. Every part is connected to a particular part of the body, and when you have the intention and rehearse and so on, finally that is goes to the motor cortex, and then to the areas that control, say, digits or hands or whatever, and then they are activated. The top segment of the motor cortex is called BA, Brodmann area number 4. It contains Betz cells that are unique to that area. So we're talking about this area here. the upper or the top segment, this area. In other words, this area here, or here, Betz cells. So what is so special about these Betz cells? They are pyramidal cells that have very long axons that extend to the lower limbs. So these axons go down way to the spinal cord, brainstem, spinal cord, all the way to your big toe. And so they are important for voluntary movement. And of course, the lower 1/3 of the primary motor cortex is dedicated to activation of the head, facial muscles, and neck muscles. As you could see from here, and using the homunculus, you can see all of this area, which is almost like half. So the afferent, when we say efferent with an E, that means motor, okay? Effect, to make an effect, physical thing. And when we say afferent or afferent, that means think about and to produce an affect. It's like you make an expression, or it is more, sensory. Of course, you make an expression with motor, movements, but in other words, afferent means sensory. It doesn't move things, but it produces a sensory effect. And then the efferent is motor. So the motor input from the primary motor cortex and from the supplementary motor cortex and from the premotor area, these three. Why are we speaking about these three? Because remember, in the previous section, when we spoke about the pyramidal tract, we said that it has actually 4 sets of fibers that come down together. Number one, you have the majority of the fibers coming from the primary motor cortex itself. So if you go here, for majority of these fibers come down right out of the primary motor cortex. Then the premotor area here is going to send 15% of the fibers that make the pyramidal tract. And then you have the supplementary motor area also sending some fibers down, some axons. And you also have some sensory neurons from the sensory motor, primary somatosensory cortex, also traveling down with, these fibers together to make that pyramidal tract. And we said that the sensory axons serve in giving feedback, channeling feedback. So that feedback is fed back to the primary motor cortex, the premotor area, and the supplementary motor area, and at the same time to the prefrontal cortex. So you can make changes very, very quickly. So these, again, send their axons to activate lower motor neurons to induce contractions of specific muscles. When we, sometimes as we speak lower motor neurons, because we have half of the body that we look at that has to do with breathing and the lifting the thorax and then the whole thing, how breathing or respiration drives phonation, and phonation drives articulation, and so on. So some fibers from these areas project directly to the spinal neurons. So you have now the big cable coming through the spine, that makes the spinal cord, and from it you have branches that go to the arms, to the different sides of the body, left and right. So connecting the cortical and lower motor centers, how do we do that? In order for the cortex to communicate with the lower brain areas and spinal structures, it must have a physical wiring or a physical pathway to go from the cortex to the brain stem, for example. So that is the pyramidal pathway, or the pyramidal track, or the pyramidal tract. All of these are correct names. So it is formed by projections from the number one, the primary motor cortex, sends a part of the bundle, and then the premotor area or cortex sends 15% of the fibers, supplementary motor area, and areas in front of the supplementary motor area also, they send some fibers. So now, but the majority of the fibers come from the motor cortex itself. And as I mentioned before, sensory fibers from the primary somatosensory cortex and other parietal areas also travel down with the pyramidal tract. It is like going on for example, an expedition, like say an engineer who is designing a big major project and is going to send a crew of workers to some place to build or to make a building. And then with the workers, that engineer is going to send the supervisor. So that supervisor is not going to build, is not going to design, it just is going to watch and look and kind of report minute by minute to the engineer, the chief engineer, what is going on. And sends like messages and images and phone, whatever it is, so that immediately on videos on the spot, the engineer who's like the boss is getting feedback directly, and at the same time also that feedback is shared with the workers themselves immediately. So the change will be quite effective instead of having to go to one layer of the administration to the next. You just identify the problem, get the feedback, correct it. So this is kind of a scheme of the primary motor cortex. I'm sorry, the cortex itself. That is the covering of the entire brain. You can think of it as it is like a pancake almost, wrapping around and being convoluted, so it can fit within the cranium, it can fit within the skull. So we take that layer that is less than 1/4 of an inch and you examine it and you'll find that it has 6 layers. So each layer has a particular kind of cells that live in it. And as you go to the 3rd layer, and particularly the 5th layer, you have these pyramidal cells. They look like a pyramid. These are the biggest brain cells in the body. And as you could see, their axons extend way to the very, very top, and they go the dendrites. And then the axons go way down, and like I mentioned, some of them just shoot right down to they reach the big toes. So these are the pyramidal cells, and this is why they call them pyramidal. And again, the entire pyramidal tract is made out of corticobulbar, the corticobulbar tract, and the corticospinal. Corticobulbar, it is within the skull. It doesn't leave, exit much, a bit of it, but mostly within the skull, connecting the cerebral cortex with the brain stem. And the corticospinal basically goes down way to the rest of the body and from the spine to the rest of the body. The corticobulbar tract is the short pathway made up of the upper motor neurons. And they extend from the cerebral areas to the cranial nerve nuclei, or the roots of the cranial nerves, and the brain stem and in the spinal cord. Their axons of the corticobulbar, or the axons of the upper motor neurons, they synapse with the cranial nerves and the spinal cord, and also they synapse with the spinal nerves as well, like nerves that go through your arms to activate your arms, or your torso, for example. The corticobulbar tract, its name has changed recently. It's still being used, but some new researchers suggest that it really shouldn't be called that, and but it will take many years for it to be kind of recognized for the new change. The functions of this tract is to control skilled and refined movements. So, facial muscles, for example, when you look at them, your neck muscles, the movements you do with these, exclusively controls the head and the facial muscles through synapsing with the roots of the cranial nerves that control these structures, neck and facial muscles inside and out. So it synapses with the cranial nerve number 5, called the trigeminal, and the facial nerve number 5, cranial nerve CN number 7, and the glossopharyngeal nerve number 9, and then the vagus nerve that goes into your trunk and activates all kinds. We spoke about it at some point when we spoke about the diaphragm and how the phrenic nerve comes from there, and also the recurrent laryngeal nerve is branching out of the vagus. We also have the accessory nerve that activates neck muscles and the shoulders to be able to go like this, nerve number 11, and then the hypoglossal nerve, which is number 12. So these are the primary ones that have to do with speech. And again, go back. So now we have the pyramidal tract, the part that goes from here to the brain stem to connect with the cranial nerves, that is made up of the upper motor neurons, and that part of the pathway is called the corticobulbar tract. Okay, and there is a disorder if someone, for example, has a damage to the corticobulbar tract. It causes what is called pseudobulbar disorder, which means the person would be laughing and laughing out of control for no reason, and then they switch immediately to crying and crying and crying for no reason. It is just because of the abnormal activation of these upper motor neurons, and that produces contractions to make the person cry or to laugh. And there's more schemas that will show you more about the corticospinal tract as it goes down directly through the spinal cord, and some other fibers. You could also again see that clearly here, and the digits and the parts that are moved, and how the wires or the axons go from there down to the brainstem. These are the cranial nerves. Again, this class is not about anatomy. That is just a quick review, and I told you about the nerves, but this shows you how the cranial nerves in the brainstem, how they basically connect to various structures in the body, and we discussed the ones that have to do with speech only. You notice I didn't cover, for example, hearing, and I didn't cover vision, but just mostly motor activation. The corticospinal tract, again, we're not going to spend too much on it because it is mostly for the lower part of the body. So the upper 2/3 of the primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex and the somatosensory area, these areas together give origin to this tract, because let's go back and look. See, that area here controls, for example, the upper part controls the lower part of the body. So you send axons from here to go to the very, very lower part of the body. See, as you could see, that's the lower part of the body. So that makes more sense because that is the corticospinal tract that goes down to move your arms and your trunk and your torso and your knees and so on. So the descending fibers from the corticospinal tract, they pass through the brainstem. Some fibers terminate in the pons. They go to the pons and stop right there. Some other fibers continue to the medulla and they form what we know as the medullary pyramids. The medullary pyramids, you could see here, there's one here, one here. Let's see if I can have another. So that is one pyramid here, that blue, and one pyramid here, but they are upside down. Let's go back here. So that is one medullary pyramid, the other, but again they are inverse, upside down. So these are formed by fibers from the corticospinal tract. So then they cross at the lower end of the medulla because they control right controls left and left controls right, again at the pyramidal decussation. So you could see, but of course some of the fibers just keep going down without crossing. You can see here at least maybe 10% of it, and then the crossover is here. That's the pyramidal decussation. The lower motor neurons, sometimes called the alpha neurons, they are neurons located in the brainstem and the spinal cord, and they directly project, they send signals directly to the skeletal musculature, which is arms, legs, and so on. So this is just to give you a quick idea about damage that happens to the upper motor neurons versus lower motor neurons, because you will deal with that in the emergency room and in when we speak about motor disorders and so on. So upper motor neurons, the damage causes delayed muscle spasticity. Like you want something and you want to do it and then nothing is happening, and then all of a sudden you get like a jerk. Increased muscle tone means like the muscles are a little bit hypo, and reflexes emerge. Reflexes, for example, if you have a baby 6 months or so, like 5 months, and you get anything like a spoon, stroke the left side or right side of the mouth, the baby immediately turns the head and tries to grab this with her mouth. So that is called the rooting reflex. If you go to the foot and get some kind of object and go like this, in like a pencil or something and script, then the baby will fan her toes. We call that the plantar reflex. If you put something in the baby's mouth, instinctively the baby is going to bite on it. It's called the biting reflex. So these are primitive reflexes babies have by nature, like sneezing and so on. And many of these reflexes, they start to disappear after 6 months, because the motor system and the voluntary, the prefrontal cortex starts to take control over the motor system to make voluntary movement instead of reflexes. So if there is damage in the upper motor neurons, that could cause some of these reflexes to go back, like when there's a car accident or something. The same adult, could be 60 years old, and when you stroke their cheek, they turn just like a baby trying to grab that and whatever it is and put it in their mouth. So again, that happens. These reflexes could go back if there is damage to these neurons. Also, paralysis is one of these. So these things don't have to occur together or in the same person, but various people might have they might represent differently in one person versus another. You might have a combination, or you might just have one thing. Lower motor neurons, the person will have flaccid paralysis, like very, very hypo, like muscle just the arm would be hanging down, very kind of, basically you can't move it at all. There's no spasticity. Decreased muscle tone and decreased reflexes. The reflexes that adults should have, for example, might not be there, like the knee jerk, for example, might be gone. Muscular atrophy, that the muscles themselves shrink, because if you don't activate the muscles, this is what they do. So now, when you speak about activation itself, all you do is, you need to say is that once the signal goes to the brain stem, then it goes to the cranial nerves, and these nerves move the organs of speech. That's it. You don't have to explain in detail and say the vocal folds do this and the lips do that. You don't have to explain any of that. Just say the signal goes from here to the brain stem, and the brain stem, the cranial nerves are going to innervate facial musculature and neck musculature. So, now we go to the next stage, which is control and coordination and refinement of motor output. It is not, it is almost, you can think of motor activation as just giving the signal to jerk the muscle and make it just, kind of, but you need to direct that movement. You need to make it refined. You need to make it more meaningful to achieve the purpose that you already have in the first place. So again, coordination and refinement and control of the movement, all of these have to go parallel to the movement so that you can correct and do the movements precisely. The basal ganglia are critical in that regard. The basal ganglia are deep in the white matter, and they receive direct projections, as we explained earlier in another section. They receive direct projections from the frontal lobe of the brain, especially the prefrontal cortex. And these projections include, projections means signals and pathways that go down to bring them. The premotor area, the supplementary motor area, the motor area, and the sensory area. All of these are connected with the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia receive projections or extensions from the frontal association cortex. Remember, an association cortex is a cortex area that connects more than one sensory channel with another, like hearing, vision, touch, and so on. So the frontal cortex, frontal cortex connects, centers that have working memory and attention with centers that have and the parietal cortex that have sensory, touch and stuff like that. So again, just make sure that you will know that the basal ganglia have connections with the premotor area, with the supplementary motor area, the motor cortex, and the sensory cortex, or the somatosensory cortex. So it also receives projections from the frontal association cortex as well, and that contributes to motivation to move. It enables you to think about your movement, and your emotions also, because your emotions give you the motivation to move. So you need to think and have the motivation in order to move. So the basal ganglia now send signals. They have connections with the thalamus and other parts of the cerebral cortex. So if there's damage to the basal ganglia, then that will cause Parkinson's disease. Like if you say Michael J. Fox or Muhammad Ali had Parkinson's disease. So you could see here is the thalamus. Here are cross-sections of the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia again have connections with, we said, the motor cortex connects with it, the premotor area, the supplementary motor area, and the somatosensory cortex. All of them connect here with the basal ganglia and send signals to it. Now the basal ganglia connects with the thalamus and sends signals to it. So there's a circuit whereby the basal ganglia kind of control functions of the thalamus, and the thalamus controls functions of the cerebral cortex, and the cerebral cortex controls functions of the basal ganglia. It's called the thalamic cortical basal ganglia motor circuit, where this is how it works. You need to know the steps. The thalamus stimulates the prefrontal cortex. It says, do something. And then the prefrontal cortex sends down the signals. Okay, the thalamus wants me to do something. So sends down the signal to the basal ganglia. Now the basal ganglia send to the thalamus and say, okay, is that what you want? So the basal ganglia tells the thalamus to dampen, to decrease, actually, to decrease the input that is going to the cerebral cortex. So as if the thalamus is telling the cerebral cortex, giving it information. Here it is. And the cerebral cortex says, this is too much. The cerebral cortex sends to the basal ganglia and says, you are a consultant. Tell me, what to do about this, maybe reduce these signals. And the basal ganglia say, okay, thalamus, reduce the signals that you are sending to the cerebral cortex. So this way, instead of putting so much force into the movement, you decrease the movement, make it more attenuated. So again, please know the steps of this and how this thalamic, cortical, and basal ganglia motor circuit works. 1, 2, 3, 4. The thalamus, it serves as the link between all sensory receptors except for smell. Smell is very special, and it doesn't need a middleman because it is your survival. Part of your survival mechanism is to recognize smells very, very quickly and to act on them. A noxious smell is going to mean that there is danger, and it could kill the person. And so all the sensory channels are connected with the thalamus. And then, and also the thalamus, so it serves as a connection between the sensory receptors and the cerebral cortex. Fibers from the thalamus travel through the internal capsule, which is a large pathway consisting of most of the axons running to and from the cerebral hemispheres. Let's see. So here, as all these neuron axons coming down, making a pathway going down like the pyramidal tract, and then they go through this area called the internal capsule. It is the internal capsule is the space between the space between the thalamus and the basal ganglia. Here you can see the internal capsule here. So these fibers come from above here and go through, and they pass through the internal capsule. So this is the thalamus. There are two of them. Thalamic, we call them thalamic nuclei, and you could see that each one, they are the size of like a bird's egg, and each one is divided into 10 big nuclei, and the motor ones are in the ventral part, which is like, if you think of this as an animal, the stomach of the animal, like beneath. And each, compartment of that is specialized in a certain kind of function. This is just to show you how the basal gang, how the thalamus is connected throughout. So it has connections, extensive connections with the frontal part of the brain, with the posterior, in like the parietal, and the visual, and with the superior, sensor and motor, and with the hearing and memory. It has extensive connections. The ventral group nuclei of the thalamus are important for motor control. Ventral, as I mentioned, like if you think of this as an animal, like a goat, the belly beneath is specialized in motor activation, motor control. So it carries information from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum to the motor cortex. Remember again, basal ganglia tell the thalamus, reduce your input when it needs to be reduced. And it sends also important sensory information to the cerebral cortex. It also sends, carries information from the cerebellum to the motor cortex. So the cerebellum would be here. It is not shown, would be here, but it connects with the thalamus, and then it makes it send it the information to the premotor cortex, to the motor cortex. So there's a special ventral or ventral posterior lateral nucleus that projects sensory information to the prefrontal cortex. So it sends sensory information to the prefrontal cortex, and again it connects basal ganglia with the motor cortex, and connects the also that basal ganglia with the cerebellum. So I'd like you to know these functions. The thalamus is very important. And there's more about the internal capsule. You could see how these neurons, as they come out and fan the axons, they called the what do you call it? It's called as a corona radiata. Just go like as they go out and puff like some kind of a plant almost. So the cerebellum itself, and again, while discussing the cerebellum as part of coordination, as part of refinement, as part of fine motor, the cerebellum, it lies inferior to the occipital lobe, and it is basically like a little brain on its own. So it receives somatosensory information from the spinal cord and from the prefrontal cortex. Again, somatosensory, sensory. It doesn't move. So it gets information from the spinal cord coming from your arms, your legs, and your body up, goes there, and then it also it receives also information from the prefrontal cortex. So that prefrontal is an area that tells you what to do, how to move, what to move, and then this one is going to refine your movement. But it gets you news from downstairs, from the other areas, how they move, and so on. So it contributes to the feedback, sending that feedback to the prefrontal cortex. The cerebellum is a mechanism for correcting motor movements. If there are errors, that cerebellum is able to correct them. It gives you balance. It gives you refined movements. And it is very important for motor learning, like in a dancing, the sequence step by step, karate, the different things that require, step by step. The cerebellum is very important in that. It compares, now this is very important. The cerebellum compares somatosensory information about, say, for example, touch, orientation, a movement of an organ or a muscle. So it compares that information with the movement commands or the directions for movement that are coming from the cortex, from the all the different parts of the cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex. So it's kind of saying, okay, I am the middle man here. The prefrontal cortex wants something to be done. And downstairs, the muscles and the legs and arms and so on are moving in a certain way. And my job is to report, to see what they are doing and match what they are doing to the intention and look and see if there is a discrepancy between what the prefrontal cortex wants and what these muscles and organs are doing. So again, it compares somatosensory input with the movement, with the intention of the movement itself. And it influences the posture and the movement. How, for example, the tongue, does it go in the location that it needs to go? Does it, how does it perform in terms of space, the movement that it does? It enables the motor command system to adapt to new changes after injury. So if someone, loses functions, they get injured, it is the cerebellum that enables them to kind of relearn the movements and to adapt to the damage. So again, the cerebellum is your anti-gravity mechanism, but all of these functions, it has many other functions, but we are speaking about the specific functions that are listed here that have to do with speech. What is the role of the cerebellum in speech motor production? So I could ask you any of these questions. Tell me the role of the thalamus in speech motor production. And you tell me if the thalamus plays a motor part or a sensory part or what exactly, as we discussed. So all these different parts, I could ask you questions. Say, what is the thalamocorticobasal ganglia motor circuit? Explain what it does and the four things that actually does and how it works. And the basal ganglia, what are they? What do they do? What is their role in motor control, refinement, and motor output? So this final part summarizes the entire process of how you generate speech, how the motor system generates speech. So first, again, we have three phases, the planning and motor programming. The programming is when it's like software. It's like we say Broca's area has grammar. It has the lexicon. So that is programming. These are like, the command, the things that a 3D printer software is like. So when you want to operate it, that is the operating system that is going to make it work. And then what do you want to produce? You get the plan for everything that you want to produce. As you want to say something, you make the plan, you make a script, and then you rehearse it, and then you send it down through the 3D printer, but in that case, through the primary motor cortex that is going to activate your muscles. So the planning process and the programming process. The whole idea of speech begins with sensory input. That means before you move, you get information from your somatosensory cortex to guide the process of making a plan. What do I want to move, and how do I move? And you make a rehearsal. And then when you make the activation, the muscles are active, you must employ sensory channeling again to get the feedback. So sensory, for example, sensory means how it begins with sensory. It involves the planning. You get images that show how the body would look in space and how the movement would look. And also you form the intention to speak. And then that arises out of a stream of sensory inputs from the posterior parietal cortex. Like this has the images of your movement of your body in space and spatial dimensions and so on. There's a heavy contribution from the memory and emotional systems, because you need to have memories of movements you did before, so you can repeat these movements without having to relearn them. And also the emotional system gives you the motivation to move and to speak. At that point, once you have the intention and the motivation, then you are going to formulate a forward simulation model that is going to tell you, this is what is going to happen, and this is how the movement is going to look, what it will look like. Almost like making a video of a play before you make the play itself, to say, this is how I envision the play is going to be. And then that model is going to show the intended movement based on the sensory information that comes from the posterior parietal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex then interacts with the premotor area of the premotor cortex, with the supplementary motor area, and with Broca's area, and with the cingulate gyrus areas that we discussed in part 1. So all of these areas get engaged in making the script, in refining the script, in rehearsing the script. Finally, the geometry, the energy the geometry of the movement. Do you move, for example, straight forward and then bend and then come back when you make the L or R, or how that is measured in 3 dimensions? The geometry of the movement, the energy cost, how much work are the muscles going to make? Will they make a lax valve? Will they make a tense valve? And it calculates the energy cost. And also the predicted consequences of the movement are also calculated. We said that the nervous system wants to conserve energy, and it's going to the motor system will calculate movements and compare them, and will go with the plan that is most energy efficient, and then that has a higher likelihood of being accurate. This shows you again how the supplementary motor cortex is, and typically this is the supplementary motor cortex, but the premotor area is below. But as you can see, they just lumped these two and that chart together. And then the primary motor cortex, sensory, Broca's area, you could see here in front of the premotor cortex. So the motor activation or execution part, the simulated model, or the forward simulated model, is fed into the primary motor cortex and the premotor area that have switches, or I kind of make it look like something that we know. So it has the cells that activate the movement itself, because that is connected directly with your muscles for speech. So the command, or the order to move, goes down through the pyramidal tract to the brainstem, where it is transmitted to the roots of the cranial nerves, and the cranial nerves directly synapse with your muscles of speech. On that level, a great deal of integration must take place. Both serial, parallel processing are involved, like sensory feedback, so that you can guide your movement and you can coordinate it. So several mechanisms are involved while the movement is ongoing. The basal ganglia dampen the force of the movement, as I explained before. They also provide adjustments for the movement itself. The cerebellum uses old scripts of learned sequences of things that you have learned before to correct errors and to help anticipate errors before they occur. to prevent them. Areas of the somatosensory cortex and other parietal areas provide proprioceptive information. It means when you move an organ, is it moving left? Is it moving right? Is it moving up, down? How is it oriented in space? Whether it's an organ or your own body, how it moves in the dimensions of space around it. So all of that is provided by the cerebellum, proprioceptive feedback. From the somatosensory cortex. And then the visual and auditory systems will provide information about the condition of the movement itself. Is it accurate? Is it not? So all of this information is fed at the same time, simultaneously, to the prefrontal cortex, to the supplementary motor area, to Broca's area, and the premotor area. Why premotor area? The premotor area, supplementary motor area, Broca's, are all planning and programming. So they need to get information immediately at the same time as the prefrontal cortex at the same time. So that instead of having someone say, go and tell your dad not to do this, or to go to the store and buy some milk, and then dad will tell his older son, go and tell Daniel, do this, and instead of doing that, then you just go directly, give the command, everyone gets it at the same time, and everyone can work on it. So again, the information, sensory information, is fed simultaneously to the prefrontal cortex that has the intention and leads the entire process, and then the somatosensory area, Broca's and premotor area, that have to do with programming and planning, and with the primary motor cortex itself. So this is the process again. I summarized it, and I hope that you study it well, and I hope that you make sense of it and understand it, because that is going to make you understand how motor speech disorders are going to work. So thank you, and the next segment is going to deal with the auditory system. Thanks. Bye.